Good morning, everyone. Last week we looked at the subject of abiding in Jesus. And so we're looking at what is healthy for our faith, our family, and our fellowship. And so last week was about our faith. Without abiding in Jesus, we don't grow. We'll get nothing out of it. Our faith will die. And so the abiding becomes increasingly important as we grow in our relationship with Jesus. We realize that our strength and our abilities, our spiritual gifts and everything come through God. And so for us to have a healthy spiritual life, we need to remain and abide in Jesus. And so this week we're going to go to the subject of what's healthy for our family. And I want to focus on probably the most important part of what's healthy for a family, and that's a marriage. And so we're going to take a look at healthy marriages today and what is unhealthy. And so for us to understand what's healthy, we have to understand what's not. And so we're going to look at a passage today from Matthew chapter 19, where Jesus is going to talk about divorce. But in the context of understanding divorce, we need to understand marriage. And so we're going to look at that text a little bit later on. Now, divorce is something that God did not design for us. It was not even an idea in the Garden of Eden. Divorce came after there was marriage. And Jesus is going to explain a little bit about marriage and divorce and God's role in it. We're going to notice that marriage is more than just a commitment and a husband and wife saying, I do, at the altar. There's something deeply and profoundly spiritual happening at marriage, during a wedding ceremony. It's about what God is doing there. And so we need to take a look at that as well in order to understand what's healthy and unhealthy. Now, for many of us, we've been married for a number of years. I've been married for close to 22 years, I believe it is. I've been married longer than I have not been married. That was an interesting statistic. Some of you have been married for 50, 60 years. And sometimes we get into funny conversations about what it's like to be married and what we think about our husbands and wives. And sometimes I think we recognize that our spouse is often full of hot air and can sound like a rubber chicken at times. And we're not exactly impressed with that, and we'd rather not be called that. And so we need to take a look at what God wants for us in marriages and in relationships, because what happens in a marriage is going to affect our faith and it's going to affect our fellowship. And so these are very interconnected. So let's take a look today at Matthew 19, verses 1 to 9. When Jesus had finished saying these things, he left Galilee and went into the region of Judea, to the other side of the Jordan. Large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. Some Pharisees came to test him, and they asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason?" "Haven't you read," he replied, "that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and said, 'For this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one. Therefore what God has joined together, let man not separate.' Why then," they asked, "did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away?" And Jesus replied, "Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. But it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for marital unfaithfulness and marries another woman commits adultery." So there are two main questions that are being asked here in this text by the Pharisees. Now, clearly the Pharisees are testing Jesus. They're trying to set him up for failure, to entrap him in some way. And so let's take a look at the two questions. And through those two questions, I want to focus on the two main subjects of this passage. The first question is, can I get a divorce for any reason? Jesus' answer, no. And he answers the question with the reason why. God created marriage, and what God did make, we don't break. That's kind of the idea behind it. And then there's a second question. Why did Moses permit divorce? And Jesus answers that, and he says, your hearts are hard. But it was not always this way. As I mentioned earlier, divorce was not even an idea in the Garden of Eden when God created Adam and Eve. And so we want to encourage healthy marriages. But in the midst of encouraging marriage and healthy marriages, we recognize that there is the reality that divorce does happen. So let's take a look at God's creation of marriage and some of the implications behind it, and then we'll look at the subject of divorce a little later. Marriage is an interesting relationship. It is the most important human relationship that you will have on this earth. Obviously, God is our most important relationship. But when it comes to human relationships, between a man and a woman, it is the most important one. We see that marriage is used as an image between how God sees Jesus and the church. Jesus is the head, the husband of the church, and the church is the bride, the body. And so this has spiritual overtones in it, that God sets an example of what the intimacy and abiding and remaining even in Jesus is going to look like. And so marriage becomes an important illustration for us. And then it's not just an illustration. Marriage becomes the very place where we grow to be holy. The marriage relationship isn't just a relationship where you tolerate the other person and try to live life together, earn money, have kids, and eventually die, and then the marriage vows are done until death do us part. Marriage is a relationship where you're called to holiness, to purity. And so that relationship, to be a healthy marriage, needs to have our commitment, not just to a commitment to each other, but a commitment to making things better. So we see in Genesis 1 that God creates marriage and that Adam and Eve are the first married couple. Divorce was not an option. It did not exist, but there they were. And what Jesus focuses on here in this text is not the power of humanity to make decisions to get married or to get divorced. Jesus focuses on the power of God to create marriage. It is what God put together he focuses on. And what God put together, we're not supposed to tear apart. Yet, that's what divorce is. It is the power of humanity to not be able to reconcile, or because our hearts are hard, and where the marriages get torn apart. And for a wide variety of reasons. And so with marriage being single-handedly the most important human relationship that you will have, it's created to be an image. And it's created to be a crucible where we are going to learn how to honor, to cherish, to love, to respect, to communicate, and even to procreate. It's the crucible where it's going to help us to burn away the impurities in our life. It is the place where we need to practice how to be good people, to practice the 2 Corinthians 5 passage on reconciliation. It is where you are going to meet somebody at their best and at their worst. It is where you're going to find the things about somebody that you never knew before. It is where you will grow so intimately aware of the details of a single individual, but that they will get to know you. And that the two are going to become one. That somehow, in some wonderful spiritual way, God is also going to take the two people and turn them into one flesh. There's a change that takes place. And so marriage is never one of those relationships where you're allowed to just stay the same. You just get to be you. The two become one. There is the refining fire. There is the sharpening of iron, one person sharpening of another. And so we can see right away that with this intense and intimate relationship that it's going to affect our faith. And that our faith is going to affect our marriage. It's both. Often we think of faith and our abiding in Jesus as what is going to be helpful and healthy for a sustaining marriage. But a healthy marriage actually helps our spiritual lives as well. You will notice in 1 Peter chapter 3, Peter says to husbands to love our wives, to respect our wives. Because if we don't, it's going to hinder our prayer life. That's a pretty powerful effect on our spiritual lives, is how we treat our marriage partner. In Gary Thomas's book, Sacred Marriage, he mentions how we need to understand in order to respect, and we need to respect in order to love. Now, granted, we can offer a level of respect and love to people even though we don't understand them. But marriage is always a process of trying to understand your husband and your wife, to learn how to respect them better and learn how to love them better. How many of us have said, because I know I have, I don't understand my wife? Or how many wives say, I don't understand my husband? That's a bit of a calling card. That's a flag waving in the air saying, hey, that's the point. Well, you're supposed to learn and understand more about your spouse so that you can respect and love each other better. With marriage deeply affecting our faith, we also need to remember that our marriage affects our fellowship, our church. Our church becomes healthier when our marriages become healthier. Our church becomes healthier when our relationships become healthier. Because what a church is just a group of people in relationship with one another. It's all about the relationships. The church, we need to be very careful of seeing the church as an organization or a building. Even with our church becoming incorporated, we can easily have the tendency to view it as a society, a legal entity, and which supersedes and over top of the spiritual entity of the church. That's a great area of problem when we start seeing marriages as a legal relationship more than as a spiritual relationship what God created. And so we need to watch out for this tendency to focus on the legal more than the spiritual and what God designed it for. When a married couple is at odds with one another, there tends to be tension and brokenness. And that starts to bleed out into other relationships. Your children are going to notice when you're at odds with each other. Your friends are going to notice. Your church is going to notice. Our relationships all affect the other relationships to some degree. And so we want to keep our relationships, especially in our marriage, healthy for a wide variety of reasons, not least of which is to have healthy relationships with our children, our grandchildren, and with our church. At home, though, there can be pain and disrespect and a lack of understanding. And somehow we are supposed to turn that off and go out into public when we don't have a pandemic on and turn that off and then put a smile on. And you'll notice that it doesn't work very well. You'll notice that people will sense it, that there's tension. Have you ever been in a room where two people are at odds with each other and there's tension? You can cut it with a knife. It's thick. Our relationships affect other relationships. And so having a healthy marriage is part of also what it means to have a healthy church, to have a healthy faith. Now, our children are going to learn how to treat their husbands and wives by how we treat one another as husbands and wives. My boys are going to learn what it means to be a husband by how I'm a husband. My daughter's going to learn how to be a wife by how my wife is, how she treats me. But not only that, but my daughter's going to learn how she should be treated by her husband by how I treat her. And the same thing with my boys and how my wife treats them. And so we notice that these relationships are so interconnected that we really need to focus long and hard about, is our marriage healthy? I hope that we would never get to the point of thinking that our marriage is good enough. If we ever start thinking that our marriage is good enough, right then and there you know that it's not healthy, because there's no such thing as a marriage that is good enough. There's always room for improvement. Just like our faith is never good enough. There's always room for improvement. We need to strive to be holier and to become better. Same thing is true in our relationships. When we don't work at these areas in our marriages, our kids are going to pick them up. Our grandkids are going to pick them up. Okay, they're going to see these things. When we're bitter and angry at an individual or a family, and we talk about it at home, our kids are going to learn to be bitter and angry at them too. Generational sins will get passed on. Abuses of a wide variety get passed on through marriage and through relationships, and it continues on to the next generation. We need to be mindful that our example has profound implications for generations to come. And so a marriage is not something that we should be taken lightly ever. And when we're notice that we're not in a healthy marriage or a healthy relationship or there's things to improve on, just remember that you're not the only ones being affected by it. We need to continue to do better, not just for our own sakes, but for the others around us. Another part of Gary Thomas's book that stuck out to me this week is how we think about our husbands and wives. A surefire way to get me mad at you is to pick on my wife or my kids. You do that, our relationship is at odds. Guaranteed. Have we ever thought that that's true about God? That your husbands are God's little boys and your wives are God's little girls. And when we treat them with disrespect and treat them poorly, that's going to anger God. Yeah, it will. We need to remember that our husbands and our wives, first and foremost, belong to God. His creation, made in His image, with His love and His mercy and compassion, that He died for them. He's saving them. He's working in them. The Spirit of God is in them. And so there needs to be a lot of grace and mercy and respect on our part on how we treat God's kids, especially in our marriages. Now, allow me to move on from the subject of marriage and God's creation of it and some of the implications behind it to divorce and the pain and the agony that's going to come through this. Divorce happens, according to Jesus in Matthew 19 here, because our hearts are hard. There's lots of blame to be passed around when a couple gets divorced. And I don't think it's helpful for us to sit back and say, well, I'm going to take the husband's side or I'm going to take the wife's side. Clearly, there could be some obvious problems and things that happen for the divorce to ensue. However, the issues probably started a long time before that. And what we need to be wary of in understanding the hardness of hearts and picking sides when people get divorced is that we become very judgmental very quickly. We demonize people. When they are at their worst, when a divorced couple is in the most pain they've ever been in their life, when there's anger and frustration, agony, a sense of loss, it's not helpful for us to shoot the wounded. I have a book in my office called Why Christians Shoot Their Wounded, and it's often because we see the evil in their life and that their hearts were hard and that they did it to themselves. I think that there's a lot of room for us to grow in learning how to have mercy and grace upon those who have hard hearts and who, might have made some bad decisions along the way, but to love them anyways, to show kindness, to understand, to show respect even in the midst of their greatest pain and tragedies. This heart issue, this hardness of heart issue is not a small one. It's going to deeply affect their relationships with other people as well. You will notice that when your friendships or people in the church are at odds with one another, that hardness of heart will bleed out. It will also bleed out into your relationship with God. When you're emotionally exhausted and hurt in your relationships, that's going to transfer over to God too. He obviously knows about it, but how you treat God is going to change as well, because we are not at our best. One of the stories in Scripture that is very powerful but also very raw in its nature is the story of Hosea. Hosea is a prophet, and he was told to go marry a prostitute. Well, you can imagine how that went. He married this prostitute. They started having kids, and she cheats on him. And she goes back to her prostitute lifestyle. God goes to Hosea and says, hey, go get your wife back, reconcile, continue, bring her back into your home. This relationship of Hosea and his wife is so painful to think about if you were involved in, about how much pain Hosea and his wife would have been in to go through all of these trials, this marital unfaithfulness that Jesus was talking about. But God uses that picture of that marriage as an image of him and Israel, and including of Jesus and the church, of how Israel and God's people, we turn our backs. We go and we become unfaithful and cheat on God all the time through our sin in a wide variety of ways. One of the interesting quotes I heard this week was, "Salvation is a free gift, but maturity comes at a great cost." Maturing in our faith and in our marriages and in our relationships with people at our fellowship, at our church, comes at great cost. We must learn to get along with each other, learn to be at peace with one another, learn to have harmony and love and respect, learn to not fight and argue and bicker over little things, learn to communicate and to understand. These principles go through all of our relationships, not just our marriage. And so when our hearts are hard, that is when we are going to pick fights. That is when we are going to be testy and sensitive, and where things that normally roll off our back easy, we tend to take personally. Hardness of hearts creeps into our lives all the time. It's what you do with it that's going to matter. It's the crucible where we get to burn away the impurities and become holier people. The hardness of heart is something that we experience almost every day of our life, and we need to work diligently and hard to practice reconciling and forgiving each other and forgiving our spouses over and over and over again, and then working hard to not do those stupid things again. But yet, we know that we will. Our lives can be characterized in some way as a perpetual state of healing relationships, because we're in a perpetual state of breaking them. And so reconciling and healing becomes an important part of revealing our spiritual lives and revealing and practicing what God does for us. Yet for all of the sins that we have committed, God's mercy and grace are great enough to save us from those sins, to heal our wounds, and to reconcile our relationship with Him. His mercy and grace are sufficient for us even when we have broken relationships with other people. But it takes a lot of practice and work. It takes a softening of our hearts. It takes a humbling of ourselves, being willing to be obedient even to the point of death, and death on a cross that Jesus endured in order to reconcile at times. It is not an easy path, but it is the path of maturity that we are on, and it comes at great cost. When we forgive somebody, we pay the cost of it. And so marriage is always about reconciling, and having a healthy marriage is always going to be about teaching your children and other people how to reconcile. Divorce separates what God put together. Divorce permanently separates a relationship. And that focuses a lot on the hardness of heart and the power of human decision to break what God has made. But God's example to us and how He treats Israel and how He treats the church is always an example of healing, of reconciling, of restoring. Now, I'm not saying that there are no valid reasons for divorce. Jesus clearly teaches that there is. But divorce was not created by God. We're the ones who made that. And I think that we need to have great patience, mercy, respect, and sensitivity to those who have gone through relational breaks and divorces, to understand that they've been through a lot in life, and those scars are going to characterize them and affect them the rest of their lives. So continue to pray for those who are in relational hurt and pain. So how can we prevent divorce? Well, there's a whole wide variety of options and counsel out there on how to have a healthy marriage and how to prevent divorce. Some of those things include counseling. Now, I know right away that many people, both men and women, are going to think, you know what, counseling is the last thing that I want to do. And that's true, because a lot of times it takes a husband or wife to say, I'm done, I'm going to leave unless we go for counseling. I want to encourage you that counseling should not be the last thing. It should be long before that point. We just need to see counseling in a different light. We see counseling as a way of failure, that we have to admit our mistakes. We have to admit that we're not good enough to take care of our marriage on our own, that we need to ask for help. What all that means is that we need to suck up our pride and realize we've failed, and we need healing, and we need help. But that's going to take our diligence and our willingness to seek it out. I want to encourage you, don't allow counseling to be the last thing that you do, because often it's too late by that point. Another thing that we can do is read marriage books together as husbands and wives. We can listen to marriage DVDs, we can watch videos, we can go on marriage retreats. Those types of things are helpful and healthy. They help top up and challenge us in ways that maybe we've been neglecting. Another thing to do is to have a posture of learning, respecting, and loving, like I've been mentioning in the last few weeks. I think we should also never assume, as I mentioned earlier today, to never believe that our marriage is good enough. To always keep working at it, which means we always need to keep working at our holiness. We also should remember that God did not create divorce. And so a stubborn commitment to stay together is important, as long as there's also a stubborn commitment to make things better. When you're in the midst of pain and relational frustration, often wanting to make things better is sometimes the last thing on our minds. And that's where God can work in your lives and work in all of our lives to humble us and realize we need to make things better. Our marriage is a sign of how committed we are in our relationships across the board. How far are we willing to go to love somebody, to reconcile, to heal? The Apostle Paul teaches us in the book of Ephesians to submit to one another. It doesn't just teach that wives submit to one another, as often is quoted, but in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 21, it says we need to submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Get rid of pride, arrogance, get rid of self-righteousness, get rid of our disrespect for the different genders. In our culture today, there's still the disrespect that men can have towards women, but just as much so, we see that there's a disrespect that women can have for men. And both of the genders are continually under attack by the opposite gender. I think we need to heal that and to get rid of those areas in our life that looks down upon somebody who is different and shows disrespect to those who are different. One of the things that we can do to have a healthy marriage is to praise your spouse as God's son or daughter. To remember them for who they really are in God's eyes, and that we need to change our eyes and a view of them as well. And like I mentioned, there's a lot of advice that could be given today. There are a lot of implications for a successful or unsuccessful marriage. But to close, I just want to say, pray for your spouse. Do good to your spouse. And love them. And the way we love them is by understanding them and then learning to respect them. Let's remember what Jesus taught. God makes the marriage. So let's go to God to figure out how to make it better. Let me pray for you. Father, in this time, we just think of all the husbands and wives across the world. We ask that you would honor those marriages and strengthen them, empower them, and heal them. We think of those marriages as well that are not doing well, that you would be their guide, that you would sustain them. We pray for those marriages that have fallen apart and have ended in divorce. And we ask that you would honor those people and help them to get rid of the hardness of heart, to bring healing into their life, and to bring dignity into their lives, because often they live with such shame and such hurt. I pray for all of the children and grandchildren that are affected by marriages and divorces, that you would remind them that the picture of Jesus and the church, of your commitment and love, is how we need to see our marriages and what we need to aim for as we think about getting into a marriage. And God, I pray that you'll continue to bless everybody as we remain in social distancing or social isolation right now. That you would take care of their physical health, but also their mental and emotional health. That there are great strains put upon all of us, and that our marriages are going to be strained through this situation. And I pray that you would bring healing and strength and wisdom to know how to act and to live, and help us to press forward with wisdom, to work well together, to complement one another, to love one another. And so bless us now in the name of Christ. Amen.